Tehran, January 2021, 3 in the morning. Inside a secure building belonging to Iran's Ministry of Intelligence, a small group of senior officers gathered around a conference table that was never supposed to be used for anything like this. The fluorescent lights above them buzzed quietly. Outside, the city slept. These men did not sleep. They had been awake for 2 days. On the table lay a thick folder of surveillance reports, transcripts, and cross-referenced intelligence assessments. The folder had been assembled in silence, passed between only 4 people in the entire ministry before reaching this room. Its contents described something so alarming that the officers who had compiled it had triple-checked every source before agreeing to present it to their superiors. The man at the head of the table read the final page, placed it face down, and was quiet for a long time. Then he said what all of them were already thinking. The fox that hunted foxes had been working for the other side. The unit they were discussing had been created specifically to destroy Mossad's network inside Iran. It was their best tool, their sharpest weapon, the one organization inside Iranian intelligence given the resources and authority to go after Israeli spies directly. Its officers had access to every ongoing counter-espionage investigation in the country. They knew the identities of suspected informants. They knew where surveillance operations were being run. They knew which scientists were under protective watch and which facilities were under active threat assessment. And the man who had led that unit for years, the man they had trusted above all others to keep Israeli intelligence out of Iran's most sensitive secrets, had been reporting everything directly to Tel Aviv. Not just him. According to the intelligence folder on that table, roughly 20 members of his team had been doing the same thing. The unit tasked with hunting Mossad had for years been a Mossad operation. Before we find out exactly how deep that betrayal ran, let me tell you a little about what this channel is. This podcast brings you real intelligence stories every single day. Not Hollywood fiction, not dramatized guesswork, but actual operations, genuine tradecraft, and the real strategic consequences behind the history that most people never get to hear. If you're as fascinated by the hidden world of espionage as I am, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. What happened in that building in January 2021 is just the beginning of this story, and what comes next is extraordinary. Oh, and one more thing before we go further. I want to know where you're listening from today. Drop a comment below with your city and country. Are you listening from London, Tehran, Tel Aviv, New York? I love seeing where this community stretches to, and I read every single comment. Now, back to the story. To understand how Iran arrived at the moment of devastating self-discovery, you have to go back to the years that forced the Islamic Republic to create the fox that hunted foxes in the first place. The decade between 2010 and 2020 was, for Iran's security establishment, a decade of humiliation. It began on a cold January morning in 2010. Masoud Ali Mohammadi, a professor of physics at the University of Tehran and a consultant to Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, was leaving his home in the Gaytariya neighborhood of northern Tehran when a remote-controlled bomb attached to a nearby motorcycle detonated. The blast shattered windows 4 stories up, hurled debris across the street, and killed the professor on the spot. Neighbors who felt the building shake reported assuming it was an earthquake. It was not an earthquake. Iranian authorities immediately blamed Israeli intelligence, and within a year, they had arrested 10 Iranian nationals they claimed had been recruited and trained by Mossad in Tel Aviv to carry out the killing. That was January. By November of the same year, it happened again. Majid Shahriari, a nuclear engineering professor at Shahid Beheshti University and a key figure in Iran's uranium enrichment research, was driving along Artesh Highway in Tehran when a team of assassins on motorcycles caught up with his car. One of them slipped a magnetic bomb onto the right front door as the motorcycle swept alongside, then accelerated away. The bomb detonated moments later. Shahriari's wife, sitting beside him, was wounded but survived. her husband, was killed instantly. In what would later emerge as extraordinary operational coordination, a simultaneous attack was carried out that same morning against Feridun Abbasi, another professor at the same university. Abbasi survived only because he threw himself out of his moving vehicle a fraction of a second before the device detonated. 2 operations, same method, same morning, same university. The message was unmistakable. Iran's security establishment scrambled. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued new protective protocols for scientists connected to the nuclear program. Intelligence officers were assigned to shadow key personnel. Safe houses were identified, but Mossad's operations did not stop. In July 2011, Dariush Rezainejad, a PhD candidate working on high-voltage switches, the kind used to trigger nuclear warheads, was shot 5 times by motorcycle-riding gunmen outside his home in Tehran. He had just picked up his daughter from kindergarten. In January 2012, Mostafa Ahmadi Roshan, a chemical engineering graduate who supervised procurement at the Natanz nuclear facility, was killed when another team of motorcycle assassins planted a bomb on his car during his morning commute on Ketebi Street. The blast killed Roshan and his driver. Iran's then intelligence minister announced the arrest of a team of 20 people in connection with the killing. He blamed the CIA, Mossad, and British intelligence. 20 people. The number was significant, and it would resurface years later in a very different context. Every one of these operations shared a quality that deeply alarmed Iranian counterintelligence analysts: precision. The assassins did not strike at random. They struck at specific scientists at specific times, using specific methods that suggested detailed prior surveillance. Someone had tracked these men's routines. Someone had confirmed their vehicles, their routes, their departure times. Someone had provided the operational intelligence that made these killings possible, and that someone was almost certainly inside Iran. The problem was structural as much as it was operational. Iran's intelligence apparatus was not a single unified organization. Responsibility for internal security was divided and overlapping, split between the Ministry of Intelligence, the Intelligence Directorate of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and various internal security branches within the military. These organizations competed for resources, guarded their information jealously, and rarely shared intelligence freely across institutional lines. For a foreign service working to recruit and run agents inside Iran, those gaps and rivalries were not a weakness to observe. They were a vulnerability to exploit. Mossad had always understood this. The agency's operational doctrine, refined over decades, did not rely primarily on technical surveillance or cyber penetration, though both were deployed extensively. It relied on human beings, scientists who could be approached with grievances, engineers who had been passed over for promotion, government insiders who had grown disillusioned, logistics personnel who knew where things were and when they would be unguarded. Mossad identified these individuals, cultivated relationships over months or years, built trust slowly, and then, when the time was right, made the offer that converted a discontented Iranian official into a long-term asset providing intelligence that no satellite could ever collect. This was not impulsive. It was patient, methodical, and devastating. By the early 2010s, with multiple assassinations behind them and more clearly being planned, Iranian authorities made a decision. They would establish a dedicated unit within the Ministry of Intelligence, not a general counter-espionage team. A specific team with specific authority designed for a specific purpose. Identify Mossad's network inside Iran, dismantle it, and end the killings. The unit they created became the fox that hunted foxes. It was given real power. Its officers had access not just to their own investigative files, but to intelligence from across the ministry. They could request information from IRGC intelligence. They could initiate surveillance on suspected informants inside the nuclear program, inside the military, inside the government itself. They could cross-reference leak patterns and triangulate who had been in proximity to sensitive information before each operation. If Mossad had penetrated Iran's institutions, this unit had the authority and the tools to find the evidence. The unit's commander was a senior intelligence official. His credentials were impeccable. His loyalty, at least on paper, was beyond question. He had spent years inside the ministry, had risen through the ranks, had earned the kind of trust that comes not from a single act, but from sustained performance over a long career. The men above him believed he was exactly who he appeared to be. They had no reason to think otherwise. Not yet. To understand what the unit's commander could have provided to Mossad, you need to understand what the fox that hunted foxes was actually doing on a day-to-day basis. Its primary function was internal cleansing. That phrase sounds bureaucratic, but in intelligence terms it described something precise and powerful: the systematic investigation of Iran's own institutions to find the people inside them who were talking to the enemy. Every leak had a pattern. Every successful foreign operation inside Iran had required someone inside Iran to make it possible. Someone who knew the target's location, someone who had access to the facility, someone who understood the security schedule. The unit's job was to find those people by working backward from outcomes. An assassination had occurred at a specific time on a specific road. Who knew the scientist traveled that route on that morning? Who was in the room when the protective protocols were assigned? Who had access to the scheduling system? Work back from the event, narrow the field, identify the source. The unit also ran vetting operations on scientists and engineers working inside the nuclear program. Security clearances in Iran, as in most countries, were not granted once and forgotten. They required periodic review, and the unit's officers were empowered to conduct those reviews, which meant they had legitimate access to the personnel files, the travel records, the financial histories, and the foreign contacts of hundreds of people connected to Iran's most sensitive projects. They monitored communications. They ran physical surveillance on individuals flagged as possible informants. They maintained lists of suspected Israeli recruitment targets. All of that information passed through the hands of the unit's commander. Mossad understood something about counterintelligence that most people outside the profession never fully appreciate. The agency tasked with detecting spies is not the safest place to hide a spy. It is the most valuable place. If you can put your asset inside the counterintelligence apparatus of your adversary, that asset does not just provide intelligence. That asset becomes a shield for every other operation you are running. The counterintelligence unit will never expose your network because your asset is running the counterintelligence unit. Every investigation that comes close will be quietly redirected. Suspicion will be pointed elsewhere. The evidence trail will go cold. This was the architecture of what Mossad had allegedly built inside Iran. The fox that hunted foxes was, in practice, hunting in circles, finding suspects who turned out to be innocent, closing files that should have stayed open, protecting operations it was supposed to be dismantling, and the whole time it appeared to be doing its job. The reports went up the chain. The briefings were delivered. The ministry's leadership had no reason to doubt the man at the head of the unit, because the man at the head of the unit was giving them exactly what they expected to see. While this was unfolding inside the ministry, Mossad was executing some of the most audacious intelligence operations in its history. In February 2016, Mossad Director Yossi Cohen, recently appointed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a former case officer who had spent his career running Arab and Iranian agents, received intelligence that Iran was doing something unusual. Since the signing of the 2015 nuclear deal, the Islamic Republic had been quietly consolidating the most sensitive documents from its military nuclear program. Decades of research, warhead designs, production plans, testing records, theoretical weapons calculations, wires to story were being gathered from dozens of scattered sites, university laboratories, and military research centers, and moved into a single central archive hidden in a run-down warehouse in the Shorabad industrial district in southern Tehran. The reason for the consolidation was, paradoxically, security. Iran's leadership feared that if the International Atomic Energy Agency ever demanded access to multiple sites, the dispersion of materials created too many potential points of exposure. Better to concentrate the archive in one location, outside the formal nuclear establishment, where IAEA inspectors would never think to look. Mossad spotted the move. Cohen decided to act. He sent a female Farsi-speaking undercover Israeli officer to Tehran for a reconnaissance mission. She walked through the Shorabad district like a resident going about her day, wearing appropriate clothing, accompanied by a male companion watching. She observed the security arrangements at the warehouse, the number of guards, their shift patterns, when the building was unoccupied, what kind of locks secured the doors, what the interior layout might be. She returned with everything Mossad needed. The intelligence was confirmed through signals interception and through human sources inside the Iranian government. Sources, analysts would later conclude, almost certainly connected to the fox that hunted foxes. Back in Israel, the Mossad built an exact replica of the warehouse. Same dimensions, same safe configuration, rows of massive metal strongboxes that would need to be cut open. Same layout of interior rooms. Agents rehearsed the operation repeatedly in the replica facility, timing every movement, practicing the cutting of each safe, optimizing the route through the building. They identified the 6 safes most likely to hold the most incriminating material, since there would not be time for all 32. The operation was codenamed Stealing the Reality. At 1 minute past midnight on the 31st of January 2018, fewer than 24 Mossad agents entered the warehouse in Shorabad. They used a jamming device to override the alarm system and breached the iron doors. Working by torchlight with cutting equipment that could burn through reinforced steel, they opened the targeted safes. They found exactly what the intelligence had promised: blueprints, production timelines, warhead designs, testing protocols, and, unexpectedly, 183 CD-ROMs containing tens of thousands of additional files. As the team worked, images of the most critical documents were transmitted in real time to a Mossad command center in Tel Aviv for verification. Within 6.5 hours, the agents had secured approximately 50,000 paper documents and another 55,000 pages of information on those disks. They were gone before the morning security shift arrived at 7. When the shift arrived and found the broken doors, Iran launched a nationwide manhunt involving tens of thousands of security personnel. They found nothing. The agents and the archive were already out of the country, smuggled across the border in a lorry with decoy vehicles driving in multiple directions around the outskirts of Tehran to draw the search away from the real exit route. Much of the captured intelligence had already been transmitted digitally before the lorry even crossed the frontier. 3 months later, Benjamin Netanyahu stood at a podium in Tel Aviv and unveiled the archive to the world. He said the documents proved Iran had lied about its nuclear weapons ambitions. He pointed to handwritten research papers that bore the fingerprints, literally, according to subsequent reporting, of the man he described as the father of Iran's nuclear weapons program, the man whose name Netanyahu told his audience to remember, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. The archive heist should have been impossible. The warehouse location was known only to a small circle inside Iran's nuclear establishment and security services. The security arrangements had never been published or shared externally. The timing of the operation required knowing precisely when the building would be unoccupied. The team moved through a city of 8 million people, executed a highly complex technical operation, and extracted 1/2 ton of physical material without triggering any of the surveillance mechanisms Iran had in place to detect exactly this kind of activity. The fox that hunted foxes was supposed to make operations like this impossible. Instead, it had made this operation possible. By the time the archive was sitting in Tel Aviv, Mossad had already identified its next target, not a facility, a person. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh Mahabadi was born in the city of Qom in March 1961. He joined the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps after the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and Shabbat, attended Shahid Beheshti University, earned a PhD from the University of Isfahan, and eventually became a physics professor at Imam Hossein University in Tehran. None of that biography, on its face, explained why Western and Israeli intelligence agencies had been tracking him for more than a decade. What explained it was the other career he was running in parallel. Fakhrizadeh led the Organization of Defensive Innovation and Research, known by its Persian acronym SP&D. He had been the driving force behind Project Ahmad, Iran's most serious documented attempt to develop the core technologies required to build a nuclear weapon, research into uranium metal, high-explosive testing, warhead configuration, and the triggering mechanisms that separate a scientific curiosity from a functional bomb. The UN Security Council had ordered his assets frozen in the mid-2000s. The United States had listed him as a proliferation risk. And in April 2018, Netanyahu had stood in front of the stolen archive and pointed to documents handwritten by Fakhrizadeh as evidence of what Iran had been hiding. Netanyahu told the world to remember that name. Mossad had already been watching him since at least 2007. The planning for what would eventually happen began in earnest in late 2019 and accelerated through early 2020. A team of Israeli agents entered Iran. They were not rushing. They had a specific mandate: establish surveillance on Fakhrizadeh's movements and routines, gather enough information to design an assassination that could be executed without any Israeli operatives being physically present at the kill site. The reason for that constraint was both strategic and operational. A team of foreign assassins on Iranian soil, armed and in proximity to the target, represented an enormous risk of capture, exposure, or diplomatic catastrophe. Mossad wanted something that could be triggered from outside the country, something that would leave the physical scene clear of any personnel who could be traced back to Tel Aviv. What they designed was a weapon unlike anything previously used in an assassination. The core of the device was a modified FN MAG machine gun. The FN MAG is a Belgian-manufactured general-purpose machine gun, a weapon designed for military use that fires 7.62 mm rounds at a rate of up to 1,000 per minute. Mossad's engineers attached this weapon to a robotic apparatus and powered the entire system with artificial intelligence designed to compensate for a specific problem: the time delay introduced when a remote operator controls a weapon from thousands of miles away via a satellite uplink. At that distance, the lag between the operator's input and the gun's response was enough to miss a moving target. The AI was programmed to calculate the target's speed and trajectory and adjust the weapon's aim autonomously to account for the delay. The entire device weighed approximately 1 ton. Getting it into Iran required extraordinary patience. The weapon was disassembled and smuggled into the country in small pieces over a period of 8 months. Iranian agents working with Mossad received the components, stored them, and assembled the device without any single person in the supply chain knowing what the complete picture looked like. The assembled weapon, along with a camera system and an explosive device designed to self-destruct after the operation, was mounted in the back of a blue Nissan Zamyad pickup truck, a common Iranian commercial vehicle that would attract no attention parked on the side of a road. The surveillance team had learned that Fakhrizadeh traveled on Fridays from Tehran to a country house he owned in the village of Absard, east of the capital. His security detail consisted of 11 bodyguards traveling in separate vehicles. The road to Absard required drivers heading east out of Tehran to make a U-turn at a specific junction. The pickup truck was positioned at that junction. On the morning of November 27, 2020, Fakhrizadeh was in his own car, a black Nissan Tiana sedan, driving himself. His wife sat in the passenger seat beside him. His security convoy followed behind. Fakhrizadeh had been warned by his protection team not to travel that day. He dismissed the warning. He had a class to teach and a meeting he considered important. He was not a man who believed his own death was likely, even after years of being told he was a primary target. He made the U-turn at the junction. A Mossad sniper, operating from an undisclosed location thousands of miles outside Iran, had his position at the controls. The camera on the pickup truck had been tracking the convoy. The sniper was calibrating the AI targeting system when the Nissan came around the turn and slowed for a speed bump in the road. The gun fired. The first burst of rounds hit the Nissan below the windshield. The car swerved and stopped. Fakhrizadeh opened the door and crouched outside the vehicle. 3 more bullets found him, tearing into his spine. He collapsed onto the road. His wife, who had been sitting 25 centimeters from him in the same car, was not hit. Not once. In fewer than 60 seconds, the machine fired a total of 15 rounds, struck its specific human target multiple times, and did not harm a single other person in the convoy. The blue Nissan truck then detonated, destroying much of the robotic apparatus, though Iranian security forces arriving at what Fakhrizadeh's son would later describe as a full-blown war zone recovered enough components to reconstruct what had happened. The chief of Fakhrizadeh's security detail had thrown himself onto his principal as the shots came. He took 4 bullets and survived. Fakhrizadeh was airlifted by helicopter to a hospital in Tehran. He died from blood loss caused by damage to his spine. Iran's leadership erupted in fury. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei promised a decisive response. Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif cited what he called serious indications of an Israeli role. The IRGC's deputy commander confirmed to state media that no attackers had been present at the scene, that a satellite-controlled machine gun with artificial intelligence had been used, and that it had zoomed in on Fakhrizadeh's face with enough precision to spare his wife. Israel said nothing publicly. It never does. But more than 20 people had been involved in the operation, Israeli and Iranian nationals both. The Iranian members of the team had placed the weapon, confirmed the target's identity as his convoy approached, and disappeared before any arrest could be made. 20 people, Iranian, working for Mossad. The same number Ahmadinejad would later say were operating inside the unit designed to stop exactly this. The Natanz nuclear facility, meanwhile, was enduring its own series of catastrophes. In July 2020, an explosion tore through the advanced centrifuge assembly plant above ground at the site, destroying most of the facility where Iran's most sophisticated centrifuges were being prepared for installation. Iranian analysts estimated the setback at 1 to 2 years. A Middle Eastern intelligence official told the New York Times it had been caused by an explosive device. An IRGC member confirmed separately that a bomb had been used. Subsequent Israeli television reporting described how the saboteur responsible for the July attack had arranged for Mossad to supply the marble foundation platforms on which the centrifuges were mounted, and that those platforms had been delivered to Natanz, already containing an enormous quantity of explosives, concealed inside the stone. Iran had installed the bomb themselves, unknowingly, and then triggered it on a schedule that suited Tel Aviv. In April 2021, Natanz was struck again. This time the target was underground, the primary enrichment halls 50 meters below the surface, protected by meters of reinforced concrete that had been specifically designed to withstand airstrikes. Explosives had been smuggled inside a piece of equipment sent abroad for repair and returned with the device already embedded. An Iranian parliamentarian later stated publicly that roughly 300 pounds of explosives had been placed inside a desk. Thousands of centrifuges were destroyed. The facility's primary and backup electrical systems were simultaneously eliminated. Iranian officials called it nuclear terrorism and announced they had identified the cause, though they stopped short of saying they had made arrests. Both Natanz operations required the same thing the archive heist had required: someone who knew the security schedules, someone who understood the procurement and logistics chains, someone who could insert compromised material into the supply pipeline without triggering the counterintelligence apparatus that was supposed to catch exactly that kind of thing. The fox that hunted foxes did not catch it, and by the spring of 2021, certain intelligence officers inside the Ministry of Intelligence were beginning to ask a question they had not previously dared to articulate. Why not? The investigation that eventually exposed the fox that hunted foxes did not begin as an investigation into the unit itself. It began as something more diffuse, a quiet, uncomfortable pattern recognition exercise being conducted by a small number of officers who had noticed that certain things were not adding up. The pattern was this. Mossad's most operationally complex successes inside Iran had one thing in common. Each of them required a level of inside knowledge that went beyond what any single recruited asset in the nuclear program could plausibly provide. The 2018 archive heist had required knowing the exact location of the warehouse, the specific layout of the safes, the precise security schedule, and the operational movements of an entire city-scale counterintelligence apparatus, knowing how to navigate around it. The Natanz operations had required knowledge of procurement chains that ran through classified government supply systems. The assassination of Fakhrizadeh had required certainty about his Friday travel pattern at a time when his protection protocols had been upgraded following the earlier assassinations. A single well-placed source could explain one of these. Two, possibly. But the cumulative picture was something different. The cumulative picture suggested not a recruited scientist or an isolated logistics official, but a central node, someone with broad institutional access who could provide Mossad not just with specific intelligence about individual targets, but with a comprehensive, continuously updated map of Iran's counterintelligence posture itself. The small group of officers conducting this assessment eventually reached a conclusion that they were deeply reluctant to state aloud. The operations they were reviewing had not just succeeded in spite of Iran's counterintelligence efforts. They had succeeded as if Iran's counterintelligence efforts did not exist, as if the fox that hunted foxes had not been hunting at all. They began examining the unit's operational record more carefully. They reviewed the investigations that had been opened in connection with the major Mossad successes of the previous decade and then quietly closed. They reviewed the cases where suspected informants had been flagged, investigated, and then cleared without any formal finding. They looked at the moments when the unit had been positioned to detect exactly the kind of operation that had subsequently succeeded, and they traced why the detection had not occurred. The pattern, once you knew to look for it, was unmistakable. The unit had been consistently, systematically failing in ways that could not be explained by incompetence alone. Its commander had been making decisions, which leads to pursue, which files to close, which suspects to release, that, in retrospect, had the effect of protecting the very operations the unit existed to stop. By early 2021, the assessment was complete. Senior ministry officials were briefed in conditions of extraordinary secrecy. What they were told that night, in whatever room that conversation took place, was the worst thing Iranian intelligence had heard in a generation. The head of the anti-Mossad unit was himself a Mossad agent, and 20 of his officers had been working alongside him. The entire apparatus that Iran had built to protect itself from Israeli penetration had been, in practice, an Israeli penetration. The unit had not been compromised. It had been controlled. Every investigation it ran had been visible to Tel Aviv. Every surveillance operation had been seen by the enemy before it began. Every suspected informant whose file crossed the unit commander's desk had either been protected or sacrificed based on what served Mossad's operational needs, not Iran's security interests. The implications were staggering. Think about everything that had happened while this unit was active. The archive heist had been conducted with the knowledge of exactly where the archive was stored, what the security arrangements looked like, and how to move through Tehran undetected by counterintelligence. The Natanz sabotage operations had required inserting compromised equipment into classified supply chains without triggering the procurement security reviews that the unit was supposed to be overseeing. The assassination of Fakhrizadeh had required surveillance of his movements over 8 months, without any of the protective monitoring that the unit was supposed to be running on senior nuclear personnel flagging the reconnaissance operation. All of it connected. All of it pointed back to the same place. What happened next was, by any ordinary standard, remarkable. Iran did not announce the discovery. There were no public arrests, no televised confessions, No state media reports of the unit's exposure. The Islamic Republic, a government that regularly broadcasts the confessions of accused spies on national television, stayed silent. Tehran, as Ahmadinejad would later note with a kind of grim understatement, was still silent about this. The reason for that silence was not hard to understand. Announcing that Mossad had run the fox that hunted foxes for years would have required Iran to answer questions it had no good answers for. How long had the unit been compromised? Which operations had the commander sabotaged? Which arrests had been prevented? Which assets had been protected? What other units or departments had been similarly penetrated? Every answer would be more devastating than the last. And then came the detail that made the entire episode almost too extraordinary to absorb. The unit commander and all 20 of his alleged Mossad colleagues were not arrested. They were not quietly detained and made to disappear into one of Iran's intelligence prisons. They fled the country, all 21 of them, and according to Ahmadinejad's account, they are now living in Israel. The man who had run Iran's counter-Mossad apparatus, who had sat through classified briefings on Israel's intelligence capabilities, who had overseen every active investigation into Israeli espionage, who had held in his hands the complete picture of Iran's most sensitive security vulnerabilities, walked out of Iran before the handcuffs were ready. I want to stop here for a moment, because this is the part of the story that has stayed with me since I first read about it. Think about the position of the unit commander. He was an Iranian citizen. He was embedded inside Iranian intelligence. He had colleagues who trusted him, superiors who believed in him. And for years, we don't know exactly how many, but for years, he operated in the most adversarial possible environment, passing intelligence to a foreign service that was using it to kill Iranian scientists and blow up Iranian nuclear facilities. He presumably knew what the intelligence he was providing was being used for. He knew about Fakhrizadeh. He may have known about the Natanz bombs. He knew what the archive would mean for the nuclear deal. And he kept going. He kept showing up to the ministry, kept filing his reports, kept running interference on investigations that might have exposed the very operations his information was enabling. Here is the question I want to put to you directly. If you had somehow found yourself in that position, knowing that continuing meant more deaths, more sabotage, more damage to the country that employed you, but that stopping or confessing meant your own death, and almost certainly the deaths of people you were connected to, what would you have done? There is no clean answer. There is no position in that maze that does not involve devastating someone. Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one, and the responses to this particular question always surprise me with how different people's moral frameworks actually are when the situation is concrete instead of abstract. Here is what happened after the exposure. Ahmadinejad was no longer president by 2021. He had served 2 terms, been barred from running again, and was increasingly at odds with Iran's supreme leadership. It was not until September 2024, in an interview with CNN Turk, that he chose to speak about what had happened. He had apparently decided that the silence protecting Iran's intelligence establishment was no longer worth maintaining, at least not by him. His former chief of staff had offered the first public hint of the scale of the problem 2 years earlier, in 2022. Ali Younesi, who had served as Iran's intelligence minister, stated in an interview that Mossad had infiltrated many government departments in the preceding decade, and that the degree of penetration was such that, in his exact words, all the country's top officials should fear for their lives. That statement, made in 2022, was alarming enough on its own. It takes on a different dimension when you understand that Younesi was describing a reality in which the unit responsible for detecting exactly that kind of infiltration had itself been part of the infiltration. The Iranian government did not confirm or deny Ahmadinejad's account. Tehran has maintained its official silence on the episode. No arrests connected to the unit have been publicly announced. No names have been released. The Ministry of Intelligence has not acknowledged the existence of a compromised counter-Mossad team. but the former president of Iran said on international television that the man they trusted most to protect them from Israel was Israel's agent, and all 21 of them got out. In the history of modern intelligence operations, there is a particular category of achievement that professionals regard as the highest form of the craft. It is not the daring raid, the technical penetration, or the precisely executed assassination, though all of those require extraordinary skill. The highest achievement in espionage is the controlled penetration of your adversary's counterintelligence apparatus. Because when you achieve that, you have not just breached one wall, you have convinced the guardian of every wall to work for you instead. The list of times this has been accomplished at scale in modern history is short. 3 cases stand above the others. Kim Philby was a British intelligence officer of exceptional brilliance and devastating loyalty to the Soviet Union. He rose through the ranks of MI6, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service, and eventually became head of the counter-Soviet section, the very unit responsible for identifying Soviet agents inside British intelligence. From that position, he ran British counterintelligence operations against the USSR for years, while simultaneously feeding Moscow a complete picture of everything Britain and its allies knew, suspected, and were planning. He personally betrayed the names of agents sent into the Soviet Union who were arrested and executed. He warned his KGB handler when 2 of his fellow Cambridge spies, Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, were about to be exposed, giving them time to defect to Moscow. When suspicion finally fell on Philby himself, he was in Beirut working as a journalist. He disappeared to Moscow before he could be brought in for interrogation. He lived there until his death in 1988, decorated by the Soviet state he had served with such thoroughness that British intelligence never fully recovered from the damage he caused during his active years. Aldrich Ames was a CIA officer who spent 30 years inside the agency, eventually rising to a senior position in the counterintelligence section, the very unit responsible for detecting Soviet and Russian penetrations of American intelligence. From 1985 onward, he began selling intelligence to the Soviet KGB. The information he provided directly led to the identification and execution of at least 10 CIA assets inside the Soviet Union. For years, the CIA's counterintelligence analysts were trying to understand why their Soviet operations kept failing, why their sources kept being rolled up, why the penetration they were clearly experiencing could not be located. They could not find the answer because the man helping to run the search was the answer. Ames was not caught through brilliant counterintelligence work. He was caught largely because his lifestyle, a Jaguar, an expensive house, large cash transactions, was incompatible with his government salary and eventually attracted the kind of financial scrutiny that his institutional position should have prevented. He was arrested in 1994 and sentenced to life imprisonment, which is where he died in 2023. The unit commander at the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence, whose name has never been publicly released, fits this pattern at a structural level that is, if anything, more complete than either Philby or Ames. Philby's position gave Mossad the ability to monitor British counter-Soviet operations and protect Soviet assets. Ames gave the KGB the ability to destroy CIA assets inside the USSR. The Iranian unit commander gave Mossad something arguably more operationally diverse, not just visibility into one specific counterintelligence program, but access to the comprehensive picture of Iran's total counter-espionage posture, including the surveillance of nuclear scientists, the monitoring of facility security, the investigation of procurement chains, and the vetting of government officials. That access did not just allow Mossad to protect its existing operations. It allowed Mossad to understand which new operations were feasible, which targets were sufficiently unprotected, and which supply chains could be compromised without triggering detection. The fox that hunted foxes was not merely a passive intelligence collection asset. It was a planning tool for the very operations it was supposed to prevent. The sophistication required to build this situation is worth dwelling on. At some point, and we do not know when or how, or through what sequence of approaches and negotiations, Mossad cultivated the man who would become the head of Iran's anti-Mossad unit. That recruitment almost certainly predated his appointment to lead the unit. The long-term asset model that Mossad favors does not rely on catching a target in a moment of desperation and making a quick transactional offer. It relies on developing a relationship over time, establishing trust, understanding what motivates the individual, and making it possible for them to justify their cooperation to themselves, whether through ideology, grievance, financial incentive, personal loyalty, or some combination of all four. Whatever motivated him, the unit commander maintained his cover for years. He performed well enough to be trusted, produced results convincing enough to prevent suspicion from forming, and all the while fed the other side a stream of intelligence that enabled operations resulting in the deaths of Iranian scientists, the destruction of Iranian nuclear infrastructure, and the theft of Iran's most sensitive nuclear archive. 20 of his officers did the same. For Iran, the implications of the exposure rippled outward in ways that went beyond the immediate operational damage. Every major Mossad success of the preceding years had to be reassessed through the lens of what the unit had provided. The archive heist was not just a daring operation, it was an operation enabled from the inside. The Natanz bombings were not just acts of sabotage. They were acts of sabotage that the counterintelligence apparatus protecting Natanz was actively facilitating. Fakhrizadeh's assassination was not just a technological achievement. It was an assassination that had been conducted under the protective cover of the very unit assigned to keep him alive. And there was the deeper question, the one that Iranian intelligence officials must have spent sleepless nights trying to answer. How many other penetrations were still active? The unit commander was gone. His 20 officers were gone. But the network Mossad had built over a decade inside Iran's institutions did not consist only of those 21 people. They were the administrators, the coordinators, the people who kept the operation invisible from above. Below them, in the nuclear facilities, in the supply chains, in the government departments, there were other people who had been recruited, who had passed information, who had enabled the operations in ways that the unit's leadership had then protected by managing the investigations. Those people were still there. Some of them, possibly, are still there now. By 2024, the broader shadow war between Israel and Iran had reached a new level of intensity that made the story of the fox that hunted foxes feel less like an isolated scandal and more like the foundation of everything that followed. Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, who had been Iran's most powerful proxy and strategic partner for decades, was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Beirut in September 2024. Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, was killed in Tehran itself in July 2024, inside a residence that should have been one of the most secure locations in the Islamic Republic. Iranian officials publicly described the Haniyeh killing as evidence that Israel had penetrated Iranian security at the highest possible level. They were not wrong. What they may not have fully acknowledged was that the foundation for that penetration had been laid years earlier, in part by the man who was supposed to prevent exactly that. Former Intelligence Minister Younesi's 2022 warning that all senior Iranian officials should fear for their lives because of the scale of Mossad's infiltration was not hyperbole. It was a structural assessment of what happens when the organization responsible for keeping the enemy out has been, for years, run by the enemy. The story of the fox that hunted foxes does not have a clean resolution. It does not end with justice, or with the exposure of every compromise, or with a reformed and impenetrable Iranian intelligence structure rising from the wreckage. It ends with 21 people in Israel who know more about Iran's intelligence apparatus than anyone currently serving inside it. It ends with a country that built a counterintelligence unit, trusted it completely, and discovered too late that the trust had been the vulnerability. It ends with a lesson that intelligence professionals have always known, but that rarely becomes this concrete, this documented, this undeniable. The most effective way to defeat a spy hunting organization is not to fight it from the outside. It is to become it from within. If you've made it to this point in the story, I want to say thank you, genuinely. This story is one of the most layered pieces of intelligence history I've covered on this channel, and the fact that you stayed with it through every revelation tells me exactly why this community exists. This podcast brings you real operations, real tradecraft, and the full human complexity of the intelligence world every single day. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Hit that button, turn on notifications, and you will never miss another episode. There are stories in the pipeline that are every bit as extraordinary as this one, and shintokues, some even more so. But before I let you go today, I want to leave you with one final thought. So, what do you think the legacy of the fox that hunted foxes actually is? Was this the greatest single intelligence achievement in Mossad's modern history? Was it a one-time anomaly that Iranian intelligence has since corrected? Or does the scale of the operation suggest something more systemic about the vulnerability of closed, authoritarian security structures to exactly this kind of long-term penetration? And do you believe, as some analysts do, that operations like the Haniyeh killing and the Nasrallah strike were direct downstream consequences of what that unit enabled? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. The Fox That Hunted Foxes was not a story about technology or firepower or cyber capability. It was a story about trust and about what happens when the man you trust most with your secrets decides, for reasons that may never be fully explained, to give them to the other side. The documents are in Tel Aviv. The scientists are buried. The centrifuges are in pieces underground at Natanz. And 21 people who used to work inside the Ministry of Intelligence of the Islamic Republic of Iran are living free in Israel, knowing exactly what they made possible. In the secret world, there are no more powerful words than these. We were already inside.